You won't believe what NATO just did for Ukraine, and Putin definitely didn't see it coming. Global defense spending has exploded, up 9.4% in 2024 alone, hitting a staggering $2.7 trillion. NATO nations are now leading the charge, now committing to spend a jaw-dropping 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. That's not just a bump, that's a tectonic shift, one that could permanently upend Europe's security landscape. And for Ukraine, it's the lifeline it's been waiting for. From swelling military aid packages to a new arms race that's leaving Russia in the dust, this bold move signals the beginning of a radically different future. One where Europe no longer leans on the US and where Putin's worst nightmare becomes reality. Let's break down how this changes everything. On the face of it, 5% is an ambitious target. Last year, NATO members spent an average of around 2.13% of GDP on defense. So to reach 5% in the next decade will require an increase of almost 135%. That's an increase by almost a quarter every year. To put that into perspective, between 2015 and 2022, combined NATO defense spending grew more or less steadily at an average of around 3.65%. In 2023, driven by increased supplies to Ukraine, total spending increased by 9.4%. In 2024, it almost doubled again, with an increase of 17%. And in 2025, as we'll discuss a bit later on, we can probably expect an even greater increase when the dust has settled. But even so, it's still going to need some serious momentum to increase spending by 135% over the next 10 years. A large part of the challenge is that some members will have to increase their spending significantly more than others in order to meet that 5% target. Some struggle to reach the current commitment of 2%, let alone 5%. In 2014, only 3 of 28 members were spending 2% of GDP or more. By 2023, that had grown to 11 of 30 members. In 2024, 18 of 31 members had hit the target, again reflecting increasing prioritization of defense spending in the wake of Russia's invasion. As might be expected, given its proximity to Russia, Poland leads the pack in terms of defense spending as a percentage of GDP at 4.1%. That's a whopping 217% increase since 2014. Estonia, 3.43% is second, the US, 3.4% close behind, then Latvia with approximately 3.1%. The US is a special case and a critical part of this equation, as we'll discover shortly. The third Baltic state, Lithuania, ranks fifth, spending 2.9% of GDP on defense, up 324% since 2014. Sandwiched between them is Greece at 3.1%. Of NATO's 32 member states, 18 met or exceeded the 2% benchmark in 2024. The remaining 14, including Canada, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Portugal, Croatia, Slovenia, and Luxembourg, fell short. While many of these countries have steadily ramped up defense budgets since 2014, growth has been uneven and often insufficient. Now, faced with a drastically altered security landscape, they're not just aiming for 2, they've committed to 5. You may be wondering why it's 5%, especially if that kind of growth might be unfeasible. In truth, it's not entirely clear. It could be related to the relative spending levels of Russia or, to a lesser degree, China. Russia reportedly spent around 7.1% of its GDP on defense and related expenditures in 2024, an increase of almost 38% year-on-year. That's likely to increase as Russia's war machine lumbers into higher gears. China reportedly increased its defense budget by roughly 7% in 2024. However, the main reason is likely simply that 5 is the specific number that US President Donald Trump demanded. Obviously, the further away from 5% that a nation is now, the greater the increase in defense spending required to catch up. It's not immediately apparent where exactly the money is going to come from in more than a few cases. Nonetheless, all members have agreed to set 5% targets by 2035. Well, there's a small caveat to that. 2 members, while agreeing with the new target, have indicated that they don't intend actually reaching that target themselves. Those members are the US and Spain. The US's role as the behemoth at the heart of NATO is in fact one of the main reasons for NATO's decision to increase defense spending so aggressively. As previously mentioned, fear of further Russian expansionism beyond Ukraine into Eastern Europe, and possibly beyond, is also a driving force behind the move. Multiple military and political experts have estimated Russia will be ready to invade Europe by 2029 or 2030, leaving a 4 to 5 year window to prepare adequate deterrence and defense. Some have even predicted it might happen sooner. Take a look at our recent video, Germany Warns This is the Last Summer of Peace, which takes a thorough look at the different expert opinions on the matter. However, if that time frame of 29 to 30 is correct, defense spending would need to be bumped up sooner rather than gradually. The second reason is technological. The Russia-Ukraine war and evolving mayhem in the Middle East have demonstrated decisively that warfare has changed forever. And just like that, we've entered the stage of all-pervasive drones, in the air, at sea, and on land, hypersonic missiles, electronic warfare, laser weapons, and AI-integrated systems. NATO has undoubted technological superiority in terms of fighter jets, tanks, aircraft carriers, submarines, and all other major weapon systems of the past and present. It needs to replenish its stockpiles of those weapons. Vast quantities have been burnt through in Ukraine. But it also needs to implement the next generation of weapons, and at an equal or greater rate to its rivals, who aren't nearly as far behind in some areas. Then there's the US's changing role within NATO to consider. In 2024, the US spent just shy of $968 billion on defense, or over 80% of NATO's total defense expenditure, according to World Population Review. That equates to a net spend of $2,239 per capita, which is more than double that of every other NATO member except Norway and Denmark, at $1,754 and $1,479, respectively. Of the other major NATO economies, the UK spends $1,019 per capita, Germany $911, France $801, Canada $609, and Turkey just $310. So although it is stating the obvious to say that the size of the US economy dwarfs those of all other NATO members, thus enabling greater spend, the US has also clearly been shouldering the lion's share of the burden. President Donald Trump has been vocal about how unfair he believes this situation is. It was Trump who initially proposed that other NATO members increase their spending to 5% of GDP to right the balance, so to speak. But Trump's concern isn't just about sharing the burden within NATO. US foreign policy has also evolved in recent years to focus on China as its primary threat, as opposed to Russia. The US must therefore pivot to a large extent from Europe to Asia as its primary focus. That's partly strategic, driven by China's growing economic inroads into areas traditionally under the US's sphere of influence. But it's also recognition of the rapid growth in both numbers and technological prowess of China's military capabilities. For European NATO members, this new paradigm has created a new sense of urgency to strengthen their own defenses after decades of relative comfort as the primary benefactor of the US's unrivaled military might. As demonstrated by the US's recent decision to divert counter-drone systems from Ukraine to Israel, urgent shifting priorities can inadvertently leave Europe exposed and could embolden Russia. But while it's fair to suggest that Trump's position on NATO spending initially evoked feelings of confusion and even betrayal in some European members, over time the necessity of increasing their own defense spending seems to have taken root, and to the ambitious level of 5%. Taking responsibility for your own security is a solid idea, whichever way you cut it. However, although Trump initiated the idea, he does not believe the US should be spending 5%, due to its massive contribution to date and the sheer size of its existing and projected defense spending in dollar terms. Spain has also more or less refused to spend 5%. Last Thursday, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said that Spain would not have to meet the 5% target, as it would only have to spend 2.1% to meet NATO's core military requirements. We fully respect the legitimate desire of other countries to increase their defense investment, but we are not going to do so, he said in an address on Spanish television. Spain only spent 1.24% of GDP on defense in 2024, about $19.8 billion, making it the lowest spender in the alliance as a share of its economic output. So reaching 2.1% does look challenging enough, let alone 5%. It would require drastic cuts to social spending and/or tax hikes, which Sanchez is not willing to take on. Trump wasn't too impressed by this stance, stating on Friday that Spain has to pay what everybody else is going to pay, and that Madrid was notorious for low defense spending, according to Reuters. The diplomatic standoff had threatened to overshadow the forthcoming NATO summit, during which the new 5% target is due to be officially unveiled as part of the summit's statement. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had been urgently hustling to try and reach consensus between all members before the summit to avoid that eventuality. Now Rutte appears to have achieved a compromise with Sanchez. Consensus on the wording of the statement has been achieved. In a letter seen by Reuters, Rutte told Sanchez that Spain would have flexibility to determine its own sovereign path, but meeting its military capability targets agree with NATO. However, an unnamed NATO diplomat also told Reuters that Rutte's letter was simply an affirmation that allies chart their own course for making good on their commitments to meet their capability targets. Digging a bit deeper into the 5% target, concerns about where the money is going to come from certainly aren't limited to Spain. In general, Europe's economy isn't in peak condition. Independent forecasts for 2025 project contractions of 1.2% for Finland, 3% for Estonia, 0.9% for Hungary, and 0.3% for both Germany and Sweden. Meanwhile, modest growth is expected in the Netherlands and Poland, 0.1%, Lithuania and the UK, 0.3%, Norway 0.5%, Italy 0.7%, and France 0.9%. Most other NATO economies fall somewhere between 1 and 2.5%. Ironically, Spain is forecast to lead the pack with one of the highest projected growth rates in the alliance, 2.5%. The volatile geopolitical situation worldwide is echoed by an equally volatile geo-economic environment. It's characterized by trade wars, a new scramble for control over critical resources like rare earth minerals, and competition between emerging trade corridors. With Europe's long-term energy arrangements currently in flux and significant economic headwinds likely to be ahead, most analysts are cautious about growth prospects in developed economies in the near term. So the money to fund this massive increase in NATO defense spending is unlikely to come from booming state revenues. Instead, as Sanchez suggests, it's probably going to have to come from a combination of austerity, increased taxes, and debt. None of these options tend to be politically popular options at the best of times, let alone in times of tepid economic growth. That's why, in order to gather consensus for the 5% of GDP spending target insisted upon by the US, Rutte had to divide the target spend into two categories. The first category is the one that's most difficult to sell to taxpayers at the cost of reduced benefits, higher taxes, and/or higher inflation, namely traditional defense spending. That means buying new military equipment and weapons, training, equipment and deploying troops, research and development, and so on. Rutte's plan commits members to spending 3.5% of GDP on this category. For most NATO members with a current defense spend of over 2%, that's a significantly more achievable target than 5%. It'll also mean less political trade-off, such as less consequential tax hikes, making the increased defense spend easier to sell to the public. The remaining 1.5% will be committed to broader security-related spending. The definition of this category of security-related spending still has to be finalized. The idea is for these funds to be spent on upgrading roads and bridges to support heavy military vehicles, building bunkers and public safety facilities, and ramping up civil defense capabilities. This category could also be used to implement cyber measures, ranging from surveillance cameras, drones, and satellites to network and data protection measures. Many of these measures, such as upgraded roads and bridges, deliver public benefits well beyond their military applications, so they can be presented as something other than defense spending, making them more palatable to the public. Reportedly, during the discussions about how to make a 5% target feasible, leaders of some countries further away from Russia argue that since there is less they can do to protect Europe from an invasion, their spending in areas such as broader security should be counted toward their contributions. Rutte's security-related spending category allows them to do so, with no apparent objections to this strategy having emerged from the US thus far. Some other members raised concerns about the possibility of abuse of the definition by some countries. Countries could easily include general infrastructure projects with tenuous military use cases as part of their security-related spending. There are many types of infrastructure which are genuinely dual use, such as the power grid, railways, ports, and major roads. As we have proven earlier this year when NATO's Dacian Spring 2025 exercises in Romania had to be cancelled because some roads hadn't been sufficiently modernized, upgrading core infrastructure is also de facto defense spending. But the new 5% target is intended primarily for military purposes, not dual-use infrastructure. So where do you draw the line to prevent some nations bearing more of the actual military burden than others? That's why the definition of what constitutes defense spending might turn out to be an important factor in how the whole process of implementing the new commitment plays out. The Atlantic Council suggests 3 ways to expedite the process. First, establish a process or mechanism to clearly identify standards and priorities for defense-related expenditures and strengthen collective defense and societal resilience. The relatively new Joint Support and Enabling Command, or JSEC, based in Ulm, Germany, could play a key role here. It's focused on the reinforcement, enablement, and sustainment of NATO forces, so is ideally positioned to identify the infrastructure elements necessary for NATO operations, plans, and exercises. Secondly, NATO could turn the Helsinki-based European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, Hybrid Co., into a formal, subordinate alliance organization. At present, it's merely affiliated with NATO, not formally part of the alliance's structure. As with the JSEC, the Hybrid Co. has the expertise necessary to help the alliance determine which resilience efforts might be appropriately labeled defense-related, particularly in the cybersphere. Finally, the alliance should consider augmenting the mission and capabilities of the NATO Science and Technology Organization, STO, so that it can play a role in identifying the technologies that will be necessary for tomorrow's battlefields. Today, the NATO STO acts as a research enabler and clearinghouse for advanced scientific knowledge, technological developments, and innovation. But NATO could better leverage it for the purposes of identifying defense technology investment priorities. We'll have to wait and see how NATO works it all out. In the meantime, the news of the NATO defense spending increase can only be seen as a shot in the arm for Ukraine. It's fair to say that in recent weeks the US's focus has been somewhat further south than Kyiv, running diplomatic cover and support for Israel's attack on Iran, helping Israel defend itself against Iran's missile barrage retaliations, and its own daring bombing raid on Iran's main nuclear facilities have demanded the US's full attention, to say the least. The White House signals that Europe is no longer its priority, and the concurrent withering of arms supplies from the US to Ukraine have been a serious blow to Ukraine. The US has been by far the single biggest supplier of arms to Ukraine throughout the war, including, of course, critical tech like Patriot air defense systems. Ukraine's main European partners, Germany, the UK, France, the Baltic states, Poland, and others, have expressed their commitment to continue supporting Ukraine, and some have already matched words with actions, with substantial new military aid packages announced since the Trump administration took office. For example, Sweden allocated 1.6 billion euros or $1.86 billion in March, and Norway allocated 670 million euros or $770 million in April. Record monthly figures for both. In total, Nordic countries increased their aid by 5.8 billion euros or $6.73 billion between January and April 2025. The UK stepped it up as well, allocating roughly $5.2 billion so far in 2025, as did France with a contribution of around $2.55 billion. EU institutions also played a major role, allocating 12.2 billion euros, the equivalent of $14.16 billion during the same period. As a result, Europe has, for the first time since June 2022, surpassed the US in total military aid, with aid worth $83.75 billion, as compared to $75.44 billion. But the risk of not being able to adequately compensate for the US's military aid pullback has loomed large, regardless. At this point, much of Europe's defense spending is on US-made equipment and weapons anyway. This latest commitment from NATO members to a large increase in defense spending all but guarantees Ukraine significant funding for the foreseeable future. It's a huge morale booster for the battle-hardened but weary nation. The 5% target is due to be officially announced at the NATO summit in The Hague this week, and we will of course be analyzing the results. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out, and thank you, as always, for watching.